In this worksheet called approxMatch, we need to have a function in column I that's going to look up the salary from column H, and then using either the vertical table in columns M and N or the horizontal table to its right, we need to return the percent, in other words, the tax rate for that appropriate salary. The first thought might be, what will Excel do, or what will these functions do, and looking up this value? I think the way most people would understand this, thinking outside of Excel for the moment, if you were looking up 61,760 in a list of this type, you would say in effect that the 65,000 and the 10% is too high because the value hasn't reached that level. And so your answer would be 8%. And that's the way the VLOOKUP function and the way the HLOOKUP function will provide answers here. Now, we want to contrast the two functions. VLOOKUP is likely to be the better choice because it fits on the screen better, it's easier to read. Keep in mind, these tables could be in different worksheets, even in different workbooks. It's certainly going to be easier to set up if they are nearby. So let's make the column wider also so that we can actually see the function better. And let's begin by using the vertical table in columns M and N as we use VLOOKUP. We begin by selecting the value that we're trying to compare with the table. It's an H2, comma, then the location of the table itself. It'll be these cells right here, comma, and then we put in the column number of the table that has the answer. And note that I said column number, and the prompt below that says column index number. So although it's literally in column N, it's the second column of the table. If we were using VLOOKUP to find an exact match, we would use a fourth argument. And the term range lookup probably doesn't mean a whole lot, but that's necessary if we were trying to match up the data exactly. We're not trying to do that, so we're finished here, and we can press enter. And we do get our 8%. Now, what's going to happen if we copy this formula down into the next few cells? The reference to the table will drift away from it. So we want to make sure that our reference here is absolute. So we highlight these cells and press F4 to make that an absolute address. Now, there are two other solutions here that could be better, but this is certainly viable, and we could then double-click and copy this down the entire column and check out a few answers. They all make sense. The reference to the table stays constant, stays absolute, because we put in the dollar signs by selecting the table location and pressing F4. Now, one different way to do this is to give the table a name. We can highlight the cells and give it a range name by pointing to the name box, which is to the left of the formula bar. Click the drop arrow to see if there are any other range names, because we don't want any conflicts there. And use a name that does not contain spaces, cannot begin with a number. You can use upper and lower case, something like this too. You can do that, something like we see here, or possibly use an underscore. So we're naming the yellow cells tax table. Then we can come back to our formula, and instead of using this, we'll use tax table. And we could either type it, or we could go highlight the yellow cells, or we could press the F3 key to get a list of range names. We have only one, there it is there, and we'll simply click OK, pop it into place. By definition, that is automatically an absolute address. So we'll complete that and double-click the lower right-hand corner. And then all of these entries have tax table in them. Slight downside here is, if you're not the one that created the range name, when you first encounter this, you're not sure what it refers to. And what you do in those cases is go to the left of the formula bar, into the name box, click the drop arrow, highlight the name in question, and then Excel jumps over and highlights those cells, even if they happen to be on a different worksheet. A third approach to this also has merit, and it has an additional value over a range name if, over time, maybe this list will grow a bit. You might put in different breakpoints. Maybe it's going to take up a few more cells down below. So that we don't have to redefine that, we could use column references here instead of a range name. So instead of tax table, we could use MN. Just click and drag across it. Now that too is a variation on the concept of an absolute address. If we copy this function downward, it's always going to say MN. We don't have to worry about an absolute address. And as long as we put nothing else in columns M and N, except the kinds of data related to this table, this is going to work indefinitely. So that has some merit too. And it's a clean look also. Had we been using the other table, we would use not VLOOKUP, but HLOOKUP. And we simply change the V to an H. And of course, we were looking at a different table. In this example here, we'd be highlighting that and changing it to the cells over here. Now, I'm not going to give a range name to these, but we certainly could. I'll just highlight the cells. And you can see, as I scroll back leftward here, as we're looking at this here, if we were going to copy this, we'd want to make this be an absolute address. So we'd press F4. When this was a VLOOKUP, the 2 stood for the second column of the table. In an HLOOKUP, the 2 would stand for, and does stand for, the second row of the table. So even though we don't change it, it has a different meaning here. So we're going to be getting the same answer here. So whether we use an HLOOKUP like we've just seen here, or in the previous examples of a VLOOKUP, we can quickly come up with the tax rates here much, much more simply and directly than we would if we're using an if function or some other complex construction. And one other aspect of these tables that needs to be observed before we conclude this discussion is that the entries in the left column of a vertical table, or in the case of a horizontal table, the entries in the top row, must be in ascending order. Now, when they're not, strangely enough, you still might get a lot of correct answers, but it's going to be inconsistent. And so if, for example, here, if I go back to this list here, I'll just press a few Control Z's here to go back and make this be a VLOOKUP again. What happens if a mistake is made here? I'm typing this, making a correction or something, and I type 85,000. Of course, I'm doing it on purpose here. Now, watch the answers off to the left. A lot of them are going to stay the same. A couple of them changed, but you could easily be fooled into that. And so you want to make sure that these entries are in ascending order. They don't have to be equally spaced. The other thing you want to concern yourself with also is that make sure that the lowest possible entry is covered, and it certainly is in this case. If somehow this table started at 25,000 and you had a salary that was less than that, you would get a distinctly incorrect answer for sure. Any value over 95,000 in the list of salaries in column H would automatically revert to 13%. But do keep an eye on the order of these, and so to recorrect this, I'll simply make that be a 35,000 again, as it should be. So we've seen the value here of using either a VLOOKUP or an HLOOKUP function to look up information from a table.